Hello, everyone. It's Scott again. I'm really excited to be able to share with you on another passage. Today, we're going to be looking at the remainder of Mark chapter 14, which I've entitled The Obedient Lamb. And before we get started, I just want to take some time to reflect on last week and just say how special it was to see all of you in person. Um, I know there was many people who were not able to make it, and you definitely were missed. So I want you to keep that in mind. But this was just an encouraging time to be able to spend with one another, with a little bit more normalcy, I'd say, and it's kind of just a glimpse into what is to come, and it's just really exciting and kind of invigorating to see everybody there. So before we look at this passage specifically, let's take a moment to take a step back and reflect on where we've been so far in the book of Mark. So using this chart that Tanya had developed during the overview of Mark, we know that we've already gone through the first act of Mark, and now we're in the second act of Mark, and we're spending more time in Jerusalem. Uh, Now, with along the timeline of what's been going on, we're looking at about 2 days before the crucifixion. So we're really coming down to the end of Jesus' time on earth. And Jesus has been teaching many of his disciples and many people in Jerusalem, and has been teaching through parables. Last week, Tanya discussed the Passover and the Last Supper and the Festival of Unleavened Bread and its significance. And also, she discussed a important comparison between the Passover sacrifice and Jesus as the last sacrifice that was necessary for the cleansing of humanity's sins. Um, Something to keep in mind is that there's only 16 chapters in Mark, so we're really getting close to the end here. And then also just a quick word about how I will be teaching for this particular lesson. Um, you probably noticed that there was 46 verses that were remaining in the chapter 14 of Mark. I'm not going to read everything, but I definitely encourage you to go ahead and, if you haven't already, take some time reading through it now, because I will try my best to just summarize some of the sections that I'm not reading, because I think that there's just a lot of important details in this chapter, and I don't want to leave anything out, but I'm not necessarily going to spend devoted time reading through all of the passages. So we're going to pick up right where Tanya left off last week, right after the Eucharist and the celebration of Passover. And right after that happened, Jesus and his disciples go to the Mount of Olives. And while on the Mount of Olives, Jesus discusses with his disciples and predicts how they will leave him. And using the passage in Zechariah 13:7, which stated uh, that they would strike the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered, he was explaining to his disciples that in the coming days when he would be crucified, that they would abandon him and leave him. And this was probably not something that they really understood at the time. You can see in their language that they were very they were denying this, and that they were claiming that they would always stand by Jesus' side and always be with him. Um, and Peter in particular was denying that this would ever take place. And then Jesus predicted that Peter would deny him 3 times before the rooster would crow twice. Um, Something else to keep in mind is that Jesus mentioned that when he would resurrect, he would join them in Galilee. So once his disciples were scattered, they would probably return home because they didn't really maybe know where else to go. And so they would all go back home in Galilee, and Jesus would meet them there. So I've included this map here on the right. It's not labeled, but the Mount of Olives would have been this area on the right, to the east of Jerusalem rather, and just beyond the Kidron Valley. So you can imagine that the city of Jerusalem was kind of built probably on this hill area. There was a little valley and then another raised area, the Mount of Olives, and it is here that the Garden of Gethsemane is located, and that is where we're headed next. And I will go ahead and read this passage because I want to spend particular time here. So we pick up in verse 32. And they went to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, "Sit here while I pray." And he took with him Peter and James and John, and began to be greatly distressed and troubled. And he said to them, "My soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch." And going a little farther, he fell on the ground and prayed, that if it were possible, the hour might pass from him. And he said, "Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Remove this cup from me. Yet not what I will, but what you will." And he came and found them sleeping. And he said to Peter, "Simon, are you asleep? Could you not watch 1 hour? Watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak." And again he went away and prayed, saying the same words. And again he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were very heavy, and they did not know what to answer him. And he came the third time and said to them, "Are you still sleeping and taking your rest? It is enough. The hour has come. The Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand." So here we read that Jesus is with his disciples in the Garden of Gethsemane. And like I showed you on the map, that's located to the east of Jerusalem, likely on the Mount of Olives. And Gethsemane means the oil press. And it was probably called this because there was likely a lot of olive trees in this garden, and they would have been able to extract olive oil from these olives. And I took a little bit extra time to read up on this process because I thought it was interesting, but also I think it has some relevance to this story. And so what they would do is during the harvesting season, they would gather a lot of the olives, and they would place them in this mechanism here, and there would be a donkey or a mule that was tied to this roller. And what would happen is the donkey would walk around this mechanism, and the roller would just crush the olives into a paste. Now, once this paste was formed, whoever was making the olive oil would gather the paste and place them in essentially like baskets. And these baskets were very porous, and they would stack a bunch of these baskets on top of one another and um, place them in a press. And they would use one of the videos that I saw suggested that there was some weights and some various levers and mechanisms to compress these baskets. And then, as you can see, there would be oil that would leak out of these baskets, and then that oil would be harvested. Now, what's interesting is that typically there would be 3 presses that were done with the same set of baskets. And the first press would yield a very pure olive oil, and this would be viewed as the first fruits of this process. So this olive oil that was produced would have been set aside as an offering for later. Then they would press this again, and this would generate a good quality oil, and this would be used in cooking and probably for like cosmetics and other type of like perfumes and other things like that. Then the same baskets would be pressed one more time, and then this oil that was produced was of poorer quality, and this was more for utility's sake, and would have been used for oil lamps and probably making soaps and that sort of thing. So an interesting process, and there was 3 steps and 3 presses that would take place. So a lot of people liken this process that Jesus was going through of really wrestling with what was going to happen in the next couple of days, and can imagine the amount of pressure that he would have been under. So we read what Jesus was asking, if this cup could be taken from him, that he would definitely want it to be taken from him. But not what his will was, but what God the Father's will would be. In Luke, we read that his sweat was like blood, and there's some debate as to if this was actually blood that was flowing or if it was more of a simile. But regardless, it was a very stressful and emotional experience for Jesus in this garden. And if you want to look into it a little bit more, the condition is called hematohidrosis, where under high amounts of stress, capillaries can actually burst and be mixed with sweat, and you quite literally sweat blood because of it. But something for you to look up. Continuing on, I just want to mention that there's a lot of differences in the specifics of the Gospels in this garden scene. So in Mark, we read that Jesus took Peter, James, and John with him. And just to mention briefly, we see it in two other examples in Scripture where Jesus had taken Peter, James, and John with him, just the three of them. It seems like maybe he was closer with these three for whatever reason. But in Matthew 5, we read that whenever Jesus went and saw Jairus' daughter, he took these three disciples with him. And then again, during the transfiguration in Matthew 17, these were the three disciples that were with him. When Jesus is praying, he prays 3 times, and he calls out to his Father. He says, Abba, Father, and this is a term of endearment showing the respect that he had for God the Father, and kind of reflecting the relationship and intimacy that he had with the Father, and the care that he experienced from the Father. In Luke, we read that an angel actually was with Jesus during this prayer, giving him support. And then through this time of prayer, we really see how Jesus was submitting his will. He was submitting himself to the will of the Father, and he was going to be the last sacrifice, the last Passover lamb that was necessary for the cleansing of the people. Immediately after this, we read that Judas comes and arrives in the garden with a crowd. And it's likely that this crowd was composed of temple guards, Roman soldiers, and men that the Sanhedrin had hired. They were carrying weapons and definitely would have been a threatening presence. And we had read previously that Judas had gone to the chief priests and said that he would betray Jesus and that he would greet Jesus with a kiss, and that's how they would know who Jesus was. It was a sign for the guards as to who they should arrest. In Luke, we read that there actually was more of a confrontation where Peter had cut the ear of one of the guards, and Jesus had healed the guard's ear. But regardless of what had happened, the disciples do scatter, and even though they had not too long ago promised that they would never leave Jesus' side, they definitely do flee. And I think this is only mentioned in Mark 14, 51 through 52, we read that there was a man who ran away, and the thought is that this was Mark who was running away, and it was a sign of an embarrassment, but also just another example of the abandonment that Jesus was experiencing. So that text actually reads, "And a young man followed him with nothing but a linen cloth around his body. And they seized him, but he left the linen cloth and ran away naked." So I didn't know that story was in there. Thought that was interesting. So next, Jesus is taken to the council, and the council is the same thing as the Sanhedrin. And this was essentially like a court system, or the people who would carry out the law in the Jewish community. And it was comprised of 71 members. There would have been essentially 2 higher positions, like a president or a vice president, and then 69 members. And there's some debate as to who would have been comprised, or who would have comprised these remaining 69 members, whether it's the Pharisees, the Sadducees, or a combination of both of them. But regardless who was there, it was a large council. And typically, and this is where it's interesting, the Sanhedrin would normally meet during the daytime, typically daily, but they would not meet during any sort of significant holiday or any sort of festival that was occurring. Now, what just happened? Passover just happened, and the festival of unleavened bread is now in the midst of happening. So this is definitely a time where there would be festivals going on. Now, also, remember that this is the middle of the night. So it was very odd for the Sanhedrin to be meeting during this time. And reflecting back on what we read at the beginning of Mark 14, verses 1 through 2, the chief priests and the scribes were seeking how to arrest him by stealth and kill him, for they said, "Not during the feast, lest there be an uproar from the people." Jesus was very popular in this time, so it would have caused a huge issue if he was publicly arrested and convicted. So really, it makes sense that they would have tried to catch Jesus in the middle of the night and try and see him in this seemingly panic gathering of the Sanhedrin to convict him, and then pass him off to the Roman authorities to be tried and executed. So this whole process was very abnormal for the Sanhedrin. It's smaller details that I definitely didn't understand before going into this a little bit more in depth. So Jesus is seen in the Sanhedrin or seen by the Sanhedrin, and based on his claims as the Son of Man, this was viewed as blasphemy, so they were able to convict Jesus. But they didn't have the authority to execute Jesus then. They needed to get the input from Roman authorities. So that's why you see in the next chapter where Jesus is taken to Pilate, who was the Roman governor at the time. And it was the Roman authorities were needed to make the final decision on if Jesus would be executed or not. So, interesting stuff here. So I'm going to go ahead and read the remaining verses of Mark 14. We pick up in verse 66. And as Peter was below in the courtyard, one of the servant girls of the high priest came, and seeing Peter warming himself, she looked at him and said, "You also were with the Nazarene Jesus." But he denied it, saying, "I neither know nor understand what you mean." And he went out into the gateway, and the rooster crowed. And the servant girl saw him, and began again to say to the bystanders, "This man is one of them." But again he denied it. And after a little while the bystanders again said to Peter, "Certainly you are one of them, for you are a Galilean." But he began to invoke a curse on himself and to swear, "I do not know this man of whom you speak." And immediately the rooster crowed a second time. And Peter remembered how Jesus had said to him, "Before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times." And he broke down and wept. So this is another passage where there's a lot of differences in the specifics across the different Gospels. In Luke, we read that whenever Peter denied Jesus the 3rd time, Jesus actually looked out into the courtyard and made eye contact with Peter. And I can only imagine that would have been even more devastating for both of them. And in John, there's a mention that John was with Peter in the courtyard. And I looked a little bit more in depth at this just because I was interested, but it sounded like John had some sort of connection with the priests or higher Jewish authorities, so he would have been allowed to pass into this courtyard area, whereas Peter would not have been. So John, using his connections, was able to get Peter into the courtyard. Regardless of who was there and what exactly happened, Peter denied Jesus 3 times, and this happened in the time span of 2 rooster crows. I just want to mention the reason why I'm spending time in this passage a little bit more in depth is because it's one of my favorite stories in the gospel because of the redemption that comes from this. Not this particular passage, but the passage in John 21 that we read about, where Peter is reinstated by Jesus. And I just think that there's a lot of application for this storyline that takes place in our own lives, because even when we fall short and make mistakes and deny Jesus, Jesus is willing and desires to redeem us and restore us. And still, we see how much good came from Peter's ministry in the future. And I can imagine this process in this passage must have been so demoralizing to Peter, and he probably thought about this for the rest of his life, how he did not stand by his Messiah. Um, and I think that the fact that Jesus took the time to reinstate him and reassure him um, and redeem him must have been such a wholesome process and renewing process for Peter. So anyway, kind of rambled a little bit there, but I think that it's an interesting and impactful passage, at least for me. So that is the end of this section in Mark. I want to share a couple of conclusions to keep in mind. Uh, Jesus was obedient to his mission as the Passover lamb, and we see throughout this whole process it must have been so much pressure to go through with this mission. And we read in Mark 14:36 that Jesus said, "Yet not what I will, but what you will." And he was really submitting himself to the will of the Father. I also think that this is a really important example of how to pray. We need to step away from our own personal gains and our own will and allow Jesus to work through us to impact the lives of those around us. Conclusion number 2 is that Jesus affirmed once more his authority and power as the Son of Man, something that people may not realize until after his crucifixion, which is upcoming. But in Mark 14, verse 62, when Jesus is with the Sanhedrin, we read that Jesus said, "I am, and you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven." And him saying this was what was the last straw that the Sanhedrin was able to convict Jesus on. So this was an important statement that Jesus was claiming his authority as the Son of Man. So a couple of questions to reflect on. And these can be a little bit challenging. I was meaning more for this to be questions that you yourself can take time to just reflect on in your own heart and in your own experience. And if there can be beneficial conversation that comes from this during small group, then by all means, please share these thoughts and feelings that you have with your small group mates. What can we learn from the way Jesus prayed in the Garden of Gethsemane? Is your priority God's will or your own will? Is there an area in your life you feel God is asking for you to be obedient? And are you listening? Thank you again for this chance to be able to share with you. If you have any questions or concerns, or if you want to continue on the discussion anymore in any way, please feel free to reach out. And I hope that you can take what you learned from this passage and apply it to your life going forward. Thank you, everyone.